Your phone rings in the middle of the night. You know this feeling, the jolt, the panic, the reaching through darkness for a screen that's burning too bright. Someone wants something, someone needs something, someone got the number wrong. You answer anyway. That's where it starts. Not with a crime or a gun or a body in the river. It starts with a writer named Daniel Quinn saying yes to a question meant for someone else. The caller asks for Paul Auster, private detective. Quinn says no, hangs up. The phone rings again. Same voice asking for the same person who doesn't exist. Quinn says no again. Third time the phone rings. Quinn stops being Quinn. He says yes. He becomes Paul Auster. He becomes the detective. This is Paul Auster's City of Glass. This is 1985 in book form. This is postmodern fiction, but it's also a psychological autopsy, a philosophical crime scene, a map of how you lose yourself one decision at a time. Detective stories tend to have a standard pattern they follow. There's a mystery, there's a detective. The detective asks questions, follows cues, finds the answer, order restored, case closed, roll credits. City of Glass cuts into identity itself. It asks what happens when you follow someone so closely you forget who's doing the following. It asks what happens when observation becomes obsession, when the detective becomes the case, when the person you've been looking for was never there at all. Quinn is a writer. He was a writer. His wife and son died years ago. Now he writes detective novels under a fake name about a detective named Max Work who solves crimes Quinn will never solve. Quinn walks the streets of New York for hours every day, not going anywhere, just moving. Grief as geography, loss as endless navigation. The city becomes a text he reads without understanding. Then the phone call, the wrong number that rewrites everything. The caller is Peter Stillman Jr., a man whose father locked him in a dark room for 9 years as a child. The father was a theology professor obsessed with the Tower of Babel. He believed that if you could isolate a child from language, that child would speak the original tongue of God. Pure communication before the fall, before confusion, before the fracture. The father gets out of prison. The son is terrified. He hires Quinn, who he thinks is Paul Auster, the detective who doesn't exist, to follow the father, to watch him, to make sure he doesn't come back. So Quinn follows. He maps the father's routes through Manhattan. He sketches them in a red notebook. The routes start forming letters. The letters spell words. The words say Tower of Babel. The city is writing a message and Quinn is reading it, and somewhere in that exchange, Quinn stops being the reader and becomes a letter himself, a word in someone else's sentence. This isn't a novel about detective fiction. It's a novel about what happens when you try to solve the mystery of yourself and discover there's nothing to solve. When the architecture of your identity turns out to be scaffolding with no building underneath. When you realize the person you've been pretending to be is more real than the person you actually are. We're talking about Baudrillard's simulacra, the copy without an original. We're talking about Foucault's panopticon, the prison where watching creates the prisoner. We're talking about dissociative identity disorder, not as pathology, but as a way of surviving in a world that demands you be someone, anyone, as long as you're consistent. Here's the question at the center. The question that keeps this whole thing from collapsing. What happens when the role you're playing is the only thing holding you together? And what happens when that role stops making sense? Your phone is ringing. Wrong number. You answer anyway. You say yes. You become someone else. Welcome to the cartography of pain. Welcome to the architecture of identity. And welcome to the City of Glass, where everything you see is just a reflection of something that isn't there. Let's dive in.
835 field. Wrong name.
Before the phone call, Quinn was already gone. Not dead, worse, hollowed out. A man going through the motions of being a man. He writes detective novels under the name William Wilson. Notice that name, William Wilson. It's from Edgar Allan Poe. A story about a man haunted by his doppelganger, his double, his other self that follows him everywhere until he kills it and realizes he's killed himself. Quinn writes about a detective called Max Work. Max Work. Maximum effort, maximum labour. The Protestant work ethic compressed into 2 syllables. A name that sounds like punishment. But Quinn isn't Max Work. Quinn isn't even Quinn anymore. His wife died, his son died. Car accident. Sudden. The kind of sudden that splits time into before and the after is just wreckage. So Quinn walks every day, hours through New York City, not going anywhere, just moving. Stride after stride after stride. The streets become a language he can't translate. The buildings become a text without meaning. This is grief as geography. This is what happens when the map of your life gets burned and you're left wandering through ashes trying to remember where things used to be. He writes his detective novels. Max Work solves crimes. Max Work finds answers. Max Work restores order to chaos. Quinn writes these stories because he can't write his own, because his own has no solution, because some crimes don't have perpetrators, some losses don't have reasons, some pain just is. Then the phone rings. 3 a.m. A man's voice asks for Paul Auster, private detective. Quinn says no, wrong number. He hangs up. The phone rings again. Same voice, same mistake. Quinn says no again, hangs up. The phone rings a third time. This is the moment, the hinge, the place where Quinn makes the choice that unmakes him. He says yes. He becomes Paul Auster, not the real Paul Auster. There is a real Paul Auster in this novel. He's a writer. He exists. But there is no Paul Auster, the detective. That Paul Auster is a fantasy, an error, a wrong number made flesh. Quinn says yes because saying yes means becoming someone, anyone. And being anyone is better than being the man whose family is dead and whose life is just walking and writing and waiting for nothing. The caller is Peter Stillman Jr. You hear it in his voice immediately. Something wrong, something broken. His speech is fractured, childlike, circling itself. He needs help. His father is coming. His father is dangerous. His father destroyed him once and will destroy him again unless someone stops it. The father, Peter Stillman Sr., former professor of theology at Columbia, obsessed with the Tower of Babel. Obsessed with the idea that before Babel, before God confused human language and scattered the people, there was one pure tongue, the original language, the language Adam spoke in Eden when he named the animals, the language that didn't describe reality, but was reality, where word and thing were identical, where saying and being were the same. Stillman Sr. believed you could recover that language. He believed if you isolated a child from birth, locked them away from all human speech, that child would spontaneously speak the tongue of God. So he locked his son in a dark room, no light, no language, no human contact, for 9 years. From age 2 to 11, 9 years of darkness and silence and a father's voice through the door speaking invented words, nonsense syllables, trying to teach the boy the language of paradise. The boy didn't speak the language of God. The boy barely speaks at all. He was rescued eventually, and the father went to prison. 13 years. Now he's out. And the son is terrified. Terrified that the father will come back and that the experiment will resume. Terrified that after everything, he still isn't human enough, real enough, or whole enough. So Peter Stillman Jr. hires Paul Auster, private detective. Hires Quinn, pretending to be Auster. Hires a writer pretending to be a detective to follow a father who tried to turn his son into an angel. Quinn takes the case. He meets the Stillmans, Jr. and his wife Virginia. They pay him, they give him a photograph of the father, they tell him when the father arrives at Grand Central Station. They tell him to follow, to watch, to make sure he doesn't come near them. Here's what's happening underneath. Here's the architecture that's being built. Quinn is splitting himself into roles. The detective is one role, the observer is another. The writer recording everything in his red notebook is a third. But who is Quinn? Where is the core? Where is the self that these roles are supposed to protect? In psychology, we call this dissociation, the fragmenting of consciousness as a response to trauma, not multiple personality disorder. This is not the Hollywood version, just the ordinary human response to unbearable pain. You split, you compartmentalize. The part that feels becomes too dangerous, so you exile it. You create a functional self that can navigate the world, a false self that performs the role of a person without the vulnerability of actually being one. Quinn's false self isn't just the detective, it's everything. It's the writer, it's the walker, it's the man who gets up every morning and pretends yesterday didn't happen and tomorrow won't either. His true self died with his family. What's left is a man made of roles, playing a role inside a role inside a role, not a bread roll, like a function. I'm a roll inside a roll, I'm a baguette inside a loaf. And here's the thing about roles. They need an audience. They need someone to perform for. The detective needs a case. The writer needs a story. The man needs a reason to keep moving. Peter Stillman Jr. gives Quinn all three. Gives him purpose, structure. Stillman gives him the thing that grief destroys and you spend the rest of your life trying to rebuild. Meaning. Quinn goes to Grand Central Station. He waits. The train arrives. Passengers pour out. He sees Stillman Sr. Except he sees two Stillman Seniors. Two men who matched a photograph. Two old men with the same face, the same walk, the same worn suitcase. Quinn has to choose which one to follow. He follows one man out of the station into the city. This is where the detective story becomes something else. This is where order becomes chaos, and the copy stops pretending to have an original. Quinn is following a man who might not be the right man. Quinn is Paul Auster, who isn't Paul Auster. The case is real, except maybe it isn't. The father is dangerous, except maybe he's just an old man who did terrible things and got out of prison and wants to be left alone. Nothing is stable. Nothing is certain. The ground is shifting, and Quinn, who thought he was the detective, who thought he was the one doing the observing, starts to realize he's being constructed by the act of observation itself. He's not solving the mystery, he's becoming it. Baudrillard wrote about simulacra, the copy without an original, the map that precedes the territory, the image that's more real than the thing it's supposed to represent. Quinn is a simulacrum. Paul Auster, the detective, never existed, but Quinn inhabits him anyway. The role is real. The person inside the role is vanishing. Foucault wrote about the panopticon, the prison designed so one guard in a central tower can see all the prisoners, but the prisoners can't see the guard. The prisoners regulate themselves because they might be watched. Discipline becomes internal. You become your own jailer. And there is an episode on this a few months back, the panopticon, so if you're interested in that idea, I will link the video or the episode in the description. Quinn is in a panopticon of his own making. He's watching Stillman, but in watching, he's watching himself watch. Jesus Christ. The surveillance is recursive, as is my attempt to speak. The observer is circular, the observation is circular, and in that circularity, something starts to dissolve. The boundary between observer and observed. The distinction between detective and criminal. The difference between the man following and the man being followed. Quinn starts his surveillance. He follows Stillman through the streets of Manhattan, day after day. Stillman walks for hours, seemingly random routes, picking up trash, muttering to himself, stopping to stare at buildings, at pigeons, at nothing in particular. Quinn follows, Quinn records, and Quinn maps. And somewhere in that following, Quinn stops being the writer pretending to be the detective. He becomes the detective. He becomes the role. The mask fuses to the face. The costume becomes the skin. And underneath where Quinn used to be, there is just absence. Just the empty vessel waiting to be filled with whatever purpose the city provides. So this is where we learn that the detective story is a trap, that the promise of solving mysteries is a lie we tell ourselves to avoid facing the one mystery that can't be solved, the mystery of why we are here, the mystery of what it means to be a self, and the mystery of how you keep living when everything that made you real is gone. Quinn becomes the detective follows the father is writing letters in the city, And Quinn, by following, by mapping, by trying to read the message, becomes a letter himself. A word in someone else's sentence, a mark on someone else's page. The architecture is being built. The city is the structure. The surveillance is the framework. The identity is the prison. And Quinn is both architect and inmate, both builder and built, the one who maps and the territory itself. This is the labyrinth. There's no center, there's no exit. There's just the endless turning, the endless following, the endless becoming of something you're not until you can't remember what you were. The red notebook is open, the pen is moving, the detective is detecting. And somewhere in the space between the role and the person, between the mask and the face, between the simulacrum and the real, Quinn is disappearing. One step at a time, one word in the notebook at a time. Until there is nothing left but the role, until the detective is all there is. The empty vessel is the only vessel, and empty is the only thing it knows how to be. Quinn follows Stillman every day. Same routine. Stillman leaves his cheap hotel room around 8 in the morning. Walks, just walks, for hours, through Manhattan, up avenues, down side streets, through parks, past construction sites, into neighborhoods that bleed into other neighborhoods without borders or announcement. Stillman picks up objects from the street, bottle caps, pieces of wire, scraps of newspaper. He examines them like artifacts. He talks to himself. Sometimes he talks to the objects. He stops to stare at buildings, at store windows, at the sky between buildings. He moves like a man reading something no one else can see. Quinn follows 10 paces behind, 20 paces, close enough to keep Stillman in sight, far enough to stay invisible. He writes everything in the red notebook. Times, locations, cross streets. The objects Stillman collects, the words Stillman mutters. Quinn is building a record, building evidence, building the case. Except there is no case. Stillman never goes near his son, never even heads in that direction. He walks his routes and returns to his hotel. That's it. That's the whole thing. An old man walking through a city, picking up trash and talking to no one. But Quinn keeps following. He starts mapping the routes. He sketches them in his notebook, draws lines representing Stillman's path through the grid of Manhattan. At first the lines look random, chaotic, no pattern. Then Quinn starts to see it. The lines form shapes, the shapes form letters, and the letters spell words. The words say Tower of Babel. Stillman is writing, not with a pen, but with his body, his footsteps. The city is the page, the streets are the lines. And Stillman, walking his elaborate patterns day after day, is inscribing a message into the urban landscape. A message about language, about confusion, about the moment God shattered human communication and scattered the people across the earth. Quinn realizes this and something shifts. He's no longer following a man. He's reading a text, decoding a language. And in that decoding, he becomes part of the text himself. He becomes a letter, a mark, a signifier without a signified. This is where the city stops being backdrop and becomes the thing itself. New York isn't the setting for the story. New York is the story. The architecture is the syntax. The traffic is the punctuation. The people are words moving through sentences they didn't write and can't understand. You can walk forever in a city like this. Walk until your feet bleed. Walk until you forget where you started. Until you can't remember if you're going somewhere or running from something or just moving because stopping means facing what's behind you. Quinn walks, he follows Stillman, he maps the routes, fills page after page of the red notebook with observations, sketches, timestamps on cross streets and fragments of overheard conversation. The notebook becomes his anchor, the only proof that any of this is happening, that he's real and that he exists. But the notebook is also a trap, because the more Quinn writes, the more he becomes the writing. The observer becomes the observation, the detective becomes the case file, the man becomes the document. He stops going home regularly. Why go home when the surveillance demands his presence? Why sleep in a bed when he might miss something? Quinn starts sleeping on benches, in doorways, in the corners of all-night diners where the waitress stops asking if he wants more coffee and just pours it automatically. He stops eating regularly. Food becomes incidental, an interruption. He grabs things. A hot dog from a cart, a slice of pizza folded in half eaten while walking. He's losing weight. His clothes hang looser. He doesn't notice. Or he notices, but it doesn't matter. The body is just the vehicle for the watching, for the following, for the recording. People start avoiding him on the street. He stinks pretty bad now. He looks wrong. His eyes have that quality that makes people cross to the other side. Not dangerous exactly, but worse, absent, like he's looking through you at something that isn't there. This is enmeshment. In psychology, enmeshment is when the boundaries between self and other dissolve, when you can't tell where you end and they begin. It happens in families. The child who becomes the parent's emotional support, the partner who absorbs the other's moods like weather, the therapist who takes on the client's trauma and carries it home. Quinn is enmeshed with Stillman, then with the case, then with the role of detective. The boundaries are gone. He's not following Stillman anymore. He's synchronized with him. He's orbiting him. He's become a moon to Stillman's planet, locked in gravitational pull, always facing the same direction, losing speed and spiraling inward. And here's what makes it worse. Stillman knows. At some point, Stillman notices Quinn. They have conversations, long, strange conversations where Stillman talks about language and about words and the fall of man and the confusion of tongues. He talks about his son without acknowledging it's his son. He talks about his experiment like it's theoretical, like it's philosophy and not child abuse. Quinn listens and takes notes, tries to understand if Stillman is a madman or a mystic or both or neither, tries to understand if the father is actually dangerous or just broken in a different way than the son, trying to understand what he's supposed to be detecting. But detection implies something to detect, a crime, a truth, a hidden thing waiting to be revealed. What if there's nothing hidden? What if the truth is just that a man locked his child in darkness for 9 years because he believed in a fantasy about language, and now the man is out of prison walking through a city spelling words with his footsteps, and none of it means anything? What if the detective story is a genre that promises meaning in a world that has none? What if the whole apparatus of clues and deduction and revelation is just a structure we impose on chaos to make it bearable? Foucault's panopticon, remember the panopticon, the prison where the prisoners discipline themselves because they might be watched. The architecture creates the behavior. The possibility of surveillance becomes surveillance. But in City of Glass, Quinn is both guard and prisoner. He watches Stillman, but in watching, he constructs himself as watcher. The role of detective requires a crime to detect. Without the crime, the detective is just a man following another man, a stalker, a voyeur, a person without purpose. So Quinn creates the crime in his mind. He builds the threat. He interprets every action of Stillman's as potentially dangerous, every route through the city as a possible approach to the sun, every muttered word as a threat. Because if Stillman isn't dangerous, then Quinn isn't a detective. He's just homeless. He's just a man who said yes to a wrong number and let it destroy what was left of his life. This is the violence of observation. You think that watching is passive. You think the observer is separate from the observed. But observation creates reality. Heisenberg knew this in physics. You can't measure something without changing it. The act of observation collapses the wave function, forces the particle to choose a position. Quinn observes Stillman, and in observing he creates the Stillman he needs to exist, the dangerous father, the threat, the antagonist in a story that gives Quinn's surveillance meaning. But it's recursive, because Stillman is also observing Quinn, and in his observations, in his conversations with Quinn, Stillman is creating Quinn too, creating the detective, the listener, the student of language, the person who might finally understand what Stillman was trying to do. They're locked together now, observer and observed. Detective and suspect, student and teacher, each creating the other, each needing the other to be real. The city becomes a mirror reflecting a mirror reflecting a mirror. Infinite regression. No original image, just copies of copies of copies, each one a little more distorted, a little less human, and a little more abstract. Deleuze and Guattari wrote about rhizomatic structures, not the classical labyrinth with one path to the center, but the rhizome, the root system, all shoots and nodes and connections, no hierarchy, no center, no way out because there's no in or out, just the endless branching, the endless sprawl. Manhattan is a rhizome. You can walk from any point to any other point infinite ways. You can take Broadway or you can take the side streets. You can go through the park or around it. You can take the subway or you can walk. Each choice branches into more choices. Every route suggests other routes. There's no correct path. There's no destination. There's just the movement itself. Quinn is lost in the rhizome. He thinks he's following a linear path. Start point, Stillman's hotel. End point, wherever Stillman goes. But it's not linear, it's labyrinthine. And labyrinths don't lead anywhere. They just fold you deeper into their own logic until you can't remember what you were looking for. He maps the routes. Tower of Babel written in walking, in time, in the negative space between buildings. And what is the Tower of Babel about? It's about the attempt to reach heaven, the attempt to be like God, the attempt to transcend human limitation through architecture, through building, through the hubris of thinking you can construct your way to meaning. God's response is confusion. He doesn't destroy the tower, he confuses the language. Suddenly, no one can understand anyone else. The builders scatter. The tower remains unfinished, not as a monument to ambition, but as a monument to the impossibility of collective meaning. Quinn is building his own tower, building it in his notebook, building it through his surveillance, through the accumulation of data and observation and recorded fact. He thinks if he gathers enough information, he'll understand, he'll solve the case, he'll restore order. But information isn't understanding, surveillance isn't knowledge, and the more Quinn records, the more confused he becomes. The more he watches, the less he knows. The more he writes, the more the words mean nothing. His handwriting gets smaller. He's running out of pages in the notebook, so he writes smaller, more words per line. Then he starts writing in the margins. Then he starts writing over what he's already written. The pages become dense with ink, layered palimpsest, the original text disappearing under revisions, under additions, under the desperate attempt to contain everything on a finite number of pages. The notebook was supposed to be the solution, the record, the proof. Now it's becoming the problem, a black hole of information collapsing in on itself. More and more data compressed into less and less space until it becomes illegible. It becomes nothing. Quinn is disappearing into his own methodology. The tools of the detective are eating the detective. The observation is consuming the observer. And the city just keeps being the city. Indifferent, massive, unreadable, a text without an author, a language without meaning. He walks, he follows, he writes, day after day, week after week. The seasons change, summer into autumn, autumn into winter. Cold now. Quinn doesn't have a good coat, doesn't have money for a good coat. He shivers, keeps walking. The cold doesn't matter. Nothing matters except the following, except the watching, except the maintaining of the fiction that any of this means something. And then one day, Stillman is gone. Quinn goes to the hotel. Stillman isn't there. Quinn panics, searches the neighborhood, the usual routes. Nothing. Stillman has vanished. The case has vanished. The center around which Quinn has been orbiting has disappeared. Without Stillman, who is Quinn? Without the role of detective, what's left? Without the surveillance to structure his days, what does he do? Where does he go? Who does he become? The answer is nowhere. The answer is nothing. The answer is no one. Because Quinn was already nothing. He was already no one. The surveillance was the last story he had, and now even that is gone too. This is where the city stops being a place and becomes a condition, where observation stops being a method and becomes a prison, where identity stops being something you have and becomes something you perform until the performance is all there is and the theatre is empty and you're still up on stage speaking lines to no one because stopping would mean admitting you don't exist. The red notebook is almost full. The pages are black with ink, and somewhere in that blackness, under all those words, buried under all that observation and recording and desperate documentation, there was supposed to be an answer. There isn't. There never was. There's just a man following another man through a city that doesn't care. There's just the endless walking, the endless watching, the endless waiting for something to happen that will make any of this matter. And now even the thing being watched is gone, and the watcher remains, empty, purposeless, lost in a maze of his own making with no thread to lead him out, because he is the thread and the maze and the monster at the centre all at once. All of them. All disappearing into the architecture of a story that promised meaning and delivered only confusion, only Babel, only the scattering of self into fragments too small to gather, too broken to repair, and too far gone to remember what they used to be. Quinn makes a decision. He's going to find Paul Auster. Not Paul Auster the detective he's been pretending to be, Paul Auster the writer, the real one, the one who exists in this world, in this novel, as an actual person with an actual address. He looks him up in the phone book. There he is, Paul Auster, address on Riverside Drive. Quinn goes there, stands outside the building. A nice building, Upper West Side, the kind of place where writers who've actually made it live. The kind of place Quinn used to dream about before he stopped dreaming about anything. He goes up, rings the bell. A man answers the door, friendly face, slightly bemused. Paul Auster, the real Paul Auster. Married, has a young son, lives a normal life, writes books about chance and coincidence and the strange architecture of reality. But he's never been a detective, never advertised as one, never received a call from Peter Stillman Jr. Quinn explains, or tries to explain. He tells Auster about the phone calls, about becoming Paul Auster, about the case, about following Stillman, about the roots spelling Tower of Babel. He tells it like a confession, like he's reporting to the real detective what the fake detective has done. Auster listens, invites him in, makes coffee. They sit in Auster's study surrounded by books. Quinn looks around at the life Auster has, the life Quinn used to have, the life of a writer who writes and lives and has a family and hasn't been hollowed out by grief and wrong numbers. They talk. Auster tells Quinn about his work, about his theories of authorship. He talks about Don Quixote, about Cervantes, about how Cervantes wrote Don Quixote and then someone else, a fake Cervantes, wrote a sequel. And then the real Cervantes wrote his own sequel in which Don Quixote knows he's a character in a book, knows that people have read about his adventures and knows that there's a fake version of his story out there written by an imposter. Auster says fiction creates its own reality, says characters take on lives independent of their creators, says that maybe Quinn answering the phone and becoming Paul Auster, the detective, was inevitable, that the role existed before Quinn inhabited it, that names and identities are just narrative conveniences, that the I is a grammatical function, not an ontological fact. Quinn listens. He's sitting across from a man whose name he's been using, whose identity he's been wearing. And that man is telling him that identity is just a story we tell, that the self is a convenient fiction, that maybe there's no difference between the real Paul Auster and the fake one because both are equally constructed, equally performed, and equally unreal. This should be comforting. It's not. Because if identity is just performance, if the self is just a role, then what happened to Quinn? Where did he go? When did he stop being the person playing the detective and become just a detective? When did the mask fuse to the face? Auster is kind. He's interested. He treats Quinn like a colleague, like another writer working through a difficult problem. He doesn't call the police, doesn't ask Quinn to leave. He listens. He engages. He offers his thoughts on language and identity and the strange loops of selfhood. But there's something terrible happening in this conversation. Quinn came here looking for the original, the real Paul Auster against which to measure the fake one. But the real Paul Auster is telling him there is no original. There's no authentic self underneath the performances. There's just layers of performance all the way down. Lacan called this the mirror stage, the moment when the child first sees their reflection and recognizes it as themselves. But the recognition is a misrecognition. The image in the mirror is unified, coherent, and whole. The child's actual experience of themselves is fragmented, uncoordinated, and partial. So the self is born as an alienation. We become who we are by identifying with an external image. We're always looking at ourselves from outside, always seeing ourselves as others see us, always constructing identity through reflection. Quinn is in a mirror stage crisis. He's lost track of which reflection is real. He's been Paul Auster the detective, now he's sitting with Paul Auster the writer. Neither one is Quinn, or both are Quinn, or Quinn never existed in the first place. Just a name attached to a series of roles, and when the roles change, the name becomes meaningless. The conversation ends. Auster walks Quinn to the door, shakes his hand, says he'd like to hear how it all turns out, treats the whole thing like it's a story Quinn is telling, a narrative that will have an ending, a resolution, a point. Quinn leaves, walks back into the city, back into the streets, but something has broken. The real Paul Auster exists. He lives in a nice apartment, has a family, writes books, is a person. And that person is not the Paul Auster Quinn became. The Paul Auster Quinn became never existed. So who has Quinn been? What has he been doing? Following Stillman, yes. Recording observations, yes. Playing detective, yes. But playing for whom? Performing for what audience? The Stillmans hired Paul Auster the detective. That person doesn't exist. They paid money to a fiction. Quinn took the money, became the fiction, but the fiction was never real. This is Baudrillard's nightmare. The simulacrum that has no original. The copy of a copy of a copy until you can't trace it back to anything real. Quinn is a simulation of Paul Auster, who is a simulation of a detective who never existed. 3 levels deep into unreality. And at each level something is lost. Some quality of realness, some connection to the world of things and bodies and actual consequence. Lacan talks about the real, capital R real. Not reality as we experience it, which is mediated by language and culture and symbol, but the real that resists symbolization, the trauma that can't be put into words, the wound that won't become narrative. For Quinn, the real is the death of his family. That's the thing that can't be symbolized, can't be made sense of, and can't be integrated into a story that has meaning. Everything after that death is an attempt to avoid the real, to live in the symbolic order where things make sense and actions have purposes and roles have meanings. The detective story is the ultimate symbolic order. A crime happens, clues exist, the detective follows the clues, the truth is revealed and order is restored. The detective story promises that reality is intelligible, that if you're smart enough, and observant enough and persistent enough, you can solve the mystery. You can make sense of the chaos. But Quinn's detective story has no crime, or the crime already happened years ago in a dark room where a father locked his son away from language. And that crime can't be solved, it can't be undone, and it can't be made right. It just is. A wound in the fabric of the world, a place where meaning collapsed. Quinn returns to his surveillance, but it's different now. He knows Stillman is gone. Knows the case is over or never existed. But he goes to the Stillman's building anyway, parks himself outside, watches, waits. For what? For Stillman to return? For the sun to emerge? For something to happen that will make any of this cohere into meaning? Days pass, then weeks. Quinn doesn't move. He's there day and night, sitting on the steps across the street, watching the building. The doorman notices him, ignores him. People walk past, ignore him. He's become invisible, not because he's hiding, because he's become part of the architecture, part of the street furniture, a homeless man on a stoop, nothing unusual, nothing worth seeing. He runs out of money, can't buy food, starts looking gaunt, hollow. His clothes are filthy, he smells like the street, like piss and sweat and the particular funk of a body eating itself for fuel. People cross to the other side, hold their breath, look away. This is the false self collapsing. Donald Winnicott, the British psychoanalyst, wrote about the true self and the false self. The false self is the adaptive self, the self you construct to meet the world's demands, to be acceptable, to function. It's not bad, it's necessary. We all have one. But the false self becomes pathological when it's the only self, when there's no true self underneath. When the adaptation is total, when you've performed the role so long and so completely that you've forgotten there was ever supposed to be anything else. Quinn's false self has been holding him together since his family died. the writer, the walker, the detective, all false selves, all adaptive strategies, all ways of being in the world without having to feel the world. Now the false self is cracking. The detective has no case, the writer has no story, the walker has nowhere to walk to. What's the true self that's been buried under all these roles? Nothing. That's what's underneath. Nothing. Because the true self died with his family. What's left is just the wound, the absence, the place where a person used to be. Emmanuel Levinas wrote about the face of the other, the face that makes an ethical demand, the face that says, "Do not kill me," the face that establishes responsibility before any choice, any freedom, and before any self. Ethics for Levinas doesn't start with the self, it starts with the encounter, with the irreducible alterity of another person, with their face, their vulnerability, their absolute difference from you. But Quinn never encounters the face, he encounters masks, performances. Peter Stillman Jr. is traumatized, broken, his speech fractured. He's not a face, he's a wound in search of protection. Peter Stillman Sr. is obsessed, delusional, his theories about language more real to him than his own son. He's not a face, he's an abstraction. Even Paul Auster the writer, kind and thoughtful as he is encountered as a concept, a philosophical puzzle, as another text to be read. And Quinn himself has no face, has lost the face, has become faceless. The homeless are faceless, not because they lack faces, but because we refuse to look. We refuse the encounter. We refuse the ethical demands their face makes. We step around them, we look away, we make them invisible. Quinn is invisible now, sitting outside the Stillman's building, watching nothing, waiting for nothing. A man made of nothing, waiting for nothing to happen. This is the violence at the heart of the novel. Not physical violence, ontological violence. The violence of becoming no one. The violence of the world continuing when you've stopped existing. The violence of your absence mattering to no one because you've made yourself matter to no one. Quinn sits, days into weeks, weeks into months. Winter coming. The cold getting serious. He has no coat, no hat, no gloves. His fingers go numb, his feet go numb. He doesn't care. The body is just the thing that carries the watching, and the watching doesn't need warmth, doesn't need food, doesn't need anything except the object being watched. But the object isn't there. The Stillmans are gone, or they're inside and never come out, or they were never there. The building is just a building. There's nothing to watch, there's no surveillance to perform, there's no role to play. And yet Quinn stays, because staying is the only thing left, because moving would require having somewhere to move to. Leaving would mean admitting the whole thing was nothing, was always nothing, was a wrong number that became a wrong life that became no life at all. Quinn is the unfinished story, the abandoned narrative, that character written into existence by a wrong number and now sitting on a stoop across from an empty building waiting for a plot that will never arrive. Quinn is the unfinished story, the abandoned narrative. The red notebook is almost full, the pages are almost gone, and when there are no more pages, what then? When there's no more space to write, no more room to record, no more way to document the watching, what happens to the watcher? The watcher disappears. Not because he dies, because he was never really there, because watching was all he was. And when there's nothing left to watch, there's nothing left at all. Return to the closet where Quinn sits in the dark. The room within the room, the architecture of isolation. This is where we all end up in one form or another. The place where the masks come off and we face what's underneath. For Quinn, there's nothing underneath. For us, there might be. City of Glass is a warning and a map. The warning, identity is fragile, contingent, borrowed. It's not the solid thing we pretend it is. It's scaffolding, it's performance, it's a role we play so convincingly we forget we're playing it, until the audience leaves and the stage collapses, until the wrong number rings and we say yes and become someone else, because being someone else is easier than being no one. The map, and of course if you're going to navigate this world, know that the territory is always shifting. The cartographer is lost too. The streets you walk today won't be there tomorrow. The self you think you are is already becoming the self you were. The observation changes the observed. The watcher becomes the watched. The detective becomes the crime scene. The city is the mind. Every city is every mind. The streets are thoughts, the buildings are memories, the alleys are the places you don't want to go but end up anyway. The traffic is the constant noise of being alive, and somewhere in that noise you're trying to find a signal, trying to read a message, trying to decode the pattern that will make it all make sense. It won't make sense. That's the secret they don't tell you. The pattern you're seeing is pareidolia, the face in the clouds, the message in the static, the meaning you're so desperate to find that you'll write it yourself in footsteps and call it revelation. But here's the thing. Here's the terrible, beautiful thing. Even knowing it won't make sense, even knowing the maps will fail and the notebooks will fill up and the roles will consume you, you still have to try. You still have to watch. You still have to witness. Because the alternative is worse. The alternative is saying no when the phone rings, or letting people disappear without anyone noticing. The alternative is a world where Quinn sits in the closet and no one ever goes looking. So you go looking, you make the maps, you fill the notebooks, you play the roles. You walk the streets, you watch, you witness. You try to say people's names even when they've forgotten how to answer. You try to hold every story even when it's fragmenting. You try to see the face even when the face has become invisible. Not because it works, because it's what makes us human. The trying, the failing, the trying again anyway. The insistence that disappearance matters, that invisible people are still people, that the stories without endings are still stories worth telling. Paul Auster wrote City of Glass in 1985. It's more relevant now than it ever was. We're all pretending to be ourselves. We're all following invisible patterns through invisible cities. We're all detectives without cases, writers without stories, and people without proof. We are all one wrong number away from becoming someone else, or from becoming no one at all. The red notebook is almost full. The pages are running out. But before it stops, before the last page, before the final blank space, you write this. I was here. I watched. I tried to understand. I failed, but I was here. And someone someday finds that notebook, tries to read it, tries to piece together what happened, fails, but tries. And in that trying, in that failed attempt at resurrection through narrative, you remain. Not whole, but witnessed, acknowledged, real enough. This is the cartography of pain. These are the maps we make when we're lost, the identities we wear when we're naked, the stories we tell when the truth is unbearable. Your phone is ringing. Wrong number. You already know what you're going to say. The question is, can you live with what comes after? Thank you, you beautiful lot, for listening, for watching, for following this descent into the architecture of identity and the cartography of pain, for sitting with Quinn in that dark room and not looking away. If this episode did something to you, if it left a mark, or if it made you think about the roles you're playing and the person you're pretending to be, then I guess it did what it was supposed to. There are more labyrinths to walk, more philosophers to follow into the dark, and more questions that don't have answers but deserve to be asked anyway. You can find The Observing Eye everywhere that podcasts exist. No easy answers, no comfortable lies, just the attempt to see clearly in a world built on illusion. You can follow us on the socials, you know how much I love those, at Instagram, TikTok and X with the handle at The Observing Eye. They are not updated regularly at the moment, I will warn you that, so don't expect much. We're also on YouTube, which you may have found us on, which is youtube.com/@TheObservingEye, where you can subscribe, leave a comment, and tell me what dissolved you, tell me what roles you're playing, and tell me if you've ever answered the wrong number and couldn't find your way back. There's also a book. I don't think I've mentioned the book for a while. The Observing Eye, A Guide to Living a More Authentic Life, which is available on Amazon and also on the website, theobservingeye.com, which you can read it for free. Don't even have to fucking buy it, look at that. But you have to buy it on Amazon because that's just how Amazon works. It's not going to solve your problems, but it might help you see them more clearly. Thank you for being here, thank you for listening, and thank you for not hanging up when the phone rang. Take care everybody, much love, and I'll catch you soon.